We did purchase the property down there for the intermodal center. But as we go through our premium transit study we're doing now, our regional transit study, and we start to determine what the future of transit is going to be in the region, I think it'll become then more clear how we handle things like connections to the airport, whatever kind of modes we may be integrating into a future system. The one thing that we've been telling folks is we've gotten a lot of requests through Tampa Bay Next through the community outreach process to talk about transit. One of the things that we really tried to make sure that everyone understands is right now DOT is taking the lead in the premium transit study, and we've also programmed about $5 million next year for the next step, which would be the engineering study, the PD&E study for a potential transit route to be used to justify federal transit funding. But we're not going to be able to really move that forward too far without a commitment from local government in terms of dedicated funding source or some commitment for funding of the local match for transit as well as the ongoing maintenance and operations. So there's still a lot of unknowns until we get the ongoing funding situation figured out. I don't know how far we'll be able to get, but we are moving forward. We do have the land, and I guess we'll see where we go with the studies that are ongoing.
Okay, very good. We have, let's see, I've got a lot of questions up here, so we're not going to be able to get to all of these, but we're going to try and figure out a way for the folks who have submitted questions to get written responses as well, so we'll do some of that as well. I have a question about, let's see, weather impacts. And I think a couple of you may have mentioned that in terms of the gondola technology or the Lovecraft technology, lightning, rain. Would somebody like to comment on, I think wind was mentioned, but how about lightning and rain, and then we can see if Tom wants to address that as well.
Yeah, I mean, with the gondola system, you got to keep in mind that these are built for harsh alpine environments, so that they're designed for bad weather. You know, in the case of wind, as I said, you can be operational in winds of up to 60, 65 miles per hour. Above that, the system would be taken offline. But generally speaking, if you're dealing with 60, 65 mile per hour wind, you're not going to have a lot of people outside anyways. As for lightning, you would simply equip the system with a lightning protection technology, and that's relatively off-the-shelf stuff. Yeah.
There's a big difference between a tailwind, a headwind, and a crosswind. Tailwinds and headwinds aren't particularly disruptive to this type of transit. Crosswinds can create a buffering effect. The truth is that we're going to make a determination of exactly what the speed is that will provide a good ride experience for people. Probably what we'll look at very closely is when FDOT closes down the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, that might be a good indicator that it's time for us to bring our Lovecraft back home and to hold off on any more deployments until after the winds have lightened up. So we grew up in Florida. We recognize the weather aspects of things, and we want to make sure that people are assured that as former pilots that safety is our number one concern.
Hang on to that for a second, because it might be coming back to you. There was a question about public-private partnerships for these different entities, and also a question about the role of Tampa International Airport or St. Pete Clearwater International Airport in the mix. Have conversations been held with Tampa International and St. Pete Clearwater International, and talk a little bit about the role that they might play in such a system? And I think that's a fair question for PSTA as well, since they've got a TIA to Beach Express. So, Tom, you want to start?
Yes. We had Jeff Clausen at our facility, we call it the launch pad there in downtown Clearwater. We had a conversation with him, explaining the technology, and long before that we had an opportunity at a function hosted by Senator Latvala, where the chairman of Allegiant Airlines, the primary carrier that brings millions of tourists every year from around the country to PIE, We had a conversation with him about his business model and the fact that his business model might be disruptive once we provide service to PIE. PIE has a unique situation in that they can't go vertical there with their parking. So anything that can be done to alleviate the need for parking at that airport is going to enhance its future. So yes, we have. I've had conversations with Joe Lopano, but not in the depth yet. He's pretty consumed with this $2 billion expansion project that's going on right now. And when the time's appropriate, we'll go into more detail with him about what we'd like to do. The main thing would be, though, to come in on the bicycle or come in on the trail system into the airport very close to the new parking garage. And that's where that new tram, the Mitsubishi created conveyance that's going to take people from the big parking garage to the terminal. We'd like to be located somewhere in the vicinity to that.
Pass it over to Cassandra.
Yes. We always have conversations with our partners when we're developing new projects. We have sat down with the Tampa International Airport to look at their new CONRAC. And that's a multi-phase project, and they're, depending on when the TIA Express would get funded operationally, we could either come in on their first phase or on their second phase of how buses would connect into the new south end of the international airport. We've had extensive conversations with PIE through our other projects when we look at connections from Clearwater to the Gateway area and the alternatives analysis that we did a couple years ago.
Okay. Pass it along to Daryl.
Can I just say yes to it? Yeah, we've had pretty extensive conversations with Joe Lopano, and specifically where we would land and how we would integrate with its existing system, as well as St. Pete Clear Airport, Carolina, all the respective COs. Met with the owners of West Shore Mall, Tampa International Mall, all the interconnectivity, and then of course from the governor on down. Again, it's going to take everybody wanting to participate. So when you talk about whether it's just simply us building it and it's private or it's a public-private joint venture, it doesn't really matter. You're always going to have partners, and everyone participating effectively will be a partner in going forward.
If I can just quickly on the public-private partnership, I mean, we do a lot of these sort of projects around the world from a consulting perspective, and this is actually a theme that comes up really repeatedly, is how does a private sector entity come to government with an idea for linear infrastructure in the public right of way? What's the mechanism that's necessary to allow that process to go? What we see is the biggest stumbling block, and that's not just for a gondola, that's for any sort of private sector development.
From a system planning perspective, there's a pretty good question here that I think is open for any, but I'd like the transit agencies to start, and then we can turn it over to the others. Compare mass transit to personal transit and the role of each in transportation planning, because we've heard a little bit about the different models, so maybe if we could start here on the end, or start with...
Where's the MPO?
Yeah. Where is the MPO?
Yeah, where is the MPO? You want to start? Yeah, that is a question for Whit. I think that when we start putting in new technologies and thinking about how people are traveling, we have to do both. So, you know, the Department of Transportation talks about a functional classification of roadways. We need to start thinking about the functional classification of public transportation. And you have different people, different numbers of people using different elements of your system. And when you choose a technology and a capacity vehicle for that particular market, you have to be sensitive to what your customer base is.
I'll address it in a different way. You know, part of it, when I came to the project or to the organization, you know, I was looking at those processes and kind of looking at how transit just naturally happens. People get a bus, they move, a bunch of people, all that stuff. I think when we look at some of these things, we need to look more beyond that, look more to what private industry does. It's about the user experience. If it sucks, nobody's going to use it. I don't care how many millions of dollars you spend on it, if it sucks, nobody's going to use it. So obviously, we can see, understand that's important. That's what we do. But we also have to add that user experience to it also, and make sure that's accounted for. I thought that was a great perspective of what the gondola with discussion was. It's that joy of use, and I think that's really important.
Anyone of the PRT folks want to answer?
As Americans, we grew up with this idea of car ownership and having that personal, private space that we've all become very used to and very comfortable with. I think the essence of your question is, what is the difference between private and mass transit? And mass transit is designed, well, in the case of New York City, it's a primary system for a city that's so overbuilt that there's no room for anything other than subways and buses and taxis and Uber now. Private transit is a concept that's been with us for generations, and it's going to carry forward into the future. We just like our own personal space when we're traveling. We like to know who's with us in that vehicle. We find a comfort level with that. And so we're looking forward to not being exclusive to mass transit, but being part of a system where mass transit has its role. Certainly at the airport, you want to be on an airline to go to wherever it is that your destination is. But once you leave the airport, being in your own private space with your own luggage and your family members or whoever you're traveling with, that becomes the differentiator, I think, between private and mass transit.
Tom, David, go ahead, and then I'll have a question for Tom after that.
I just had wanted to add something that I think is overlooked sometimes with express lane projects that we've talked about. A lot of focus in the press and among some of the citizens that we've talked to focuses on the toll aspect of express lanes. And the fact that some people call them Lexus lanes, or they say that essentially it's going to be there for people that can afford to use them, and people who can't afford to use them are not going to benefit from the lanes. But I think we all know that we can't build enough lanes to build ourselves out of the congestion problem, and it's not going to get any better 10, 15 years in the future. It's going to continue. And one of the things that's going to, I think, encourage the shift of modes from the single vehicle person in a vehicle to multimodal, to transit, to other ways is travel time reliability. If you know that there's a reliable way for you to get from point A to point B, it may not be your first choice today to use transit, but perhaps it will in the future. And what the toll aspects of, I think the biggest benefit of the toll aspects of the express lanes is it maintains that travel time reliability. You make it disincentivized to use that lane to a certain degree so that you can maintain the travel time. It costs more as more people want to use it. But what that also does is it allows you to run things like bus rapid transit, express bus, other things in that lane. And that's one thing that DOT can build, is the express lanes in our system. And that's why tolls are a part of that element. It's not to raise the money. The money is not really the big aspect of express lanes. It's providing that travel time reliability that things like express bus and bus rapid transit can use. So I just want to make sure people remember that as we go through all the different things we may see in the future. That is one aspect of transit. Express lanes can provide a very good transit operating environment.
Another question here relates to the readiness of these technologies. And I think for the gondola project, we saw some examples of where it's being applied and being used. For the SkyTran pilot project, there's a question here about the Tel Aviv pilot. It was supposed to be up and running by now. Can you give us an update on that, Tom, and how is the technology developing?
Well, first of all, the Tel Aviv probably won't be the first system. The first system will probably be on Yaz Island with a company called Morale. And they're going to be breaking ground for that project second quarter of next year. The project in Israel is not in Tel Aviv. That's where they have a test track or a test bed set up. And that's where they've done the experimentation to perfect the propulsion system, the switching system, and the wings. All that's completed now. That was completed this summer, and now they're in their commercialization phase, and that's why they're talking with Space Florida to put in a test track so that they can demonstrate these aspects to the satisfaction of the regulatory authorities. We want to let people know that here with our pilot project, we will be probably the third or fourth system to be built. Certainly the first in the Western Hemisphere, and that's our goal, to be the first in the Western Hemisphere with an operating system.
Okay, great. Now for the gondola project, if I could, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. I'll come back to you. Can you give a little more of a detailed explanation of the funding aspect of, actually for both aerial transit projects, but we'll start with gondola first. And one question I had is, what would a public-private partnership for a gondola route look like in this region? Have any public and or private entities expressed interest? And what would be the role of local government? So we'll start with gondola, and I think a related question comes back to Tom.
I mean, generally speaking, there's multiple ways that gondolas are financed around the world. They are financed straight up where the government finances both the CapEx and the OpEx. The other situation is where it's purely a private sector play, and again, the CapEx and the OpEx is covered by the private sector. And then there are more rare public-private partnership collaborations. The two main ones would be where a government provides a ridership guarantee. So, you know, the private sector would fund the OpEx and the CapEx, but the government would say, okay, you know, we guarantee you, say, 1 million riders at $5 a head. I'm just making up numbers. And if the system fails to hit that target, then the government tops that up. The other way of doing it is that it's simply done on an availability contract where the government tends to build it or a private sector entity builds it, and then an operator will operate it. And assuming they can hit their performance targets, which they normally do, then it's just a straight up, you know, availability contract. You know, you get paid X million dollars per year to operate the system, but you keep no ticketing revenue. That's very common in airports. You probably don't know, but a lot of the airport people movers out here in North America and around the world are actually cable propelled. They're just pulled from below by a cable rather than from above. And that's a common model in that part of the industry. As for how this would work here, I'm going to give it to this guy.
Well, actually, I think you captured it. We've talked to a lot of the respective parties, and we've put forth, you know, multiple options. Ultimately, a decision needs to be made by the particular body. In this case, it would be the City of Clearwater, Pinellas County, in conjunction with, you know, everyone has the stakeholders from the, you know, the DOT, the MPO, et cetera. So a lot of what you got to depend upon. One thing neat about, you know, for some of us back in the day, we used to call them take or pay contracts. One thing that's neat about that is that the government doesn't want to take really an incremental risk. They basically step up and they say, okay, you go out, you design it, you build it, you finance it, you structure it, and we'll agree that there will be a certain amount of ridership. If you exceed that ridership, then there's really not a dollar out of pocket, and the government never has to step forward to do that. So again, a lot of it depends upon the individual municipality and the stakeholders and how they would like to proceed. You can just flip it around the other way as well. I would assume that, you know, that we would all have flexibility relative to that.
And Tom, if you could maybe address a similar type of question in terms of the public-private partnership and what you see as the role of the local government assisting your project in control.
Similarly, we've shared our vision with the City of Clearwater. We need to have a right-of-way relationship, and that's the key thing right now for us. And in order to get there, we need to have this feasibility study for the bridge and to determine the best station locations for the system. As far as the financing of the system is concerned, we've been self-funded. We've been doing this without having to go anywhere for grant money or for handouts of any form from taxpayers or government entities. We want to continue with a free enterprise solution for transportation here. We also have recently put in place a private placement This is on the streets right now, and we'll be happy to talk with any investors about it. We're seeking to raise $1 to $3 million at this time, which will fund us through the purchase contract phase of things. Now, once we get to placing the contract for the hardware, that will be financeable. The question then becomes, how much of it do we want to finance by loans, and how much of it do we want to use from private equity? We envision a public offering of stock at some point in the future, and that's kind of the direction. It's kind of the free enterprise business model that seems to help a lot of companies get established and go quickly to where they need to go.
Lucian, was there something you wanted to add on to an earlier question or comment? I saw you getting ready, and I may have cut you off.
No.
Okay. Question for Secretary Gwynn. Can you talk a little bit about how do we fund the widespread deployment of connected infrastructure? And has the department taken a look at that yet, or where do we stand on that endeavor?
Well, most of this is relatively new, so I can't say we've got a whole bunch of structure set up for that, but it's going to be probably following similar processes that we've used for other investments in infrastructure. There'll be certain funds that will be available to the federal government. There'll be others that are state and others that are local. So I don't really have a good answer on how we're going to fund that yet, but we are looking as the technology emerges for how we'll adapt our system to that.
Sort of a related question we have, has anyone estimated the cost of a District 7-wide connected traffic signal system?
I wouldn't have those numbers at my hands right now, but for instance, we are right now in the city of Tampa deploying a large move in their upgrade of their system. And it's in the millions of dollars. It's not an inexpensive. There's a lot of cost involved in the technology of obviously the hardware, but there's also a lot of detection that's involved. We have to put in a whole lot more equipment that we don't have out there, particularly now. But we are making that investment, and the MPO has been prioritizing that. But it's a lot. It's not inexpensive, but when you look at the benefit to cost ratio, it certainly more than justifies the investment.
And just for a little bit of historical perspective, the Pinellas MPO has also prioritized the development of an ITS, Intelligent Transportation System, advanced traffic management system throughout Pinellas County, and we're nearing completion of that major investment that was authorized through a penny of the gas tax. So Pinellas County has done quite a lot for a connected signal system. I think the key is how do you get that connected district-wide, and it's a bunch of different components is what I'm hearing that need to come before. But there is an overall architecture and an overall strategy. It's a matter of moving it forward from a financial standpoint.
There is, and we've also invested more in the beginning of the ITS deployment. It was focused more on the limited access facilities, on the interstate system, putting out information systems and traffic management systems. And now we're deploying that more to the arterial networks. And so there's a lot going on with it. There's still a lot left to go. And now as we start to get vehicles to communicate directly to the infrastructure, adds a new dimension to it. So, but there is a lot of funds being spent on that now.
Okay. I'm going to pivot a little bit back to transit for a minute. We've got a bunch of questions. I'm not going to get into all of them, but one would be what portion of, and I think this is stemming from the idea of this is very disruptive technology that we're talking about. What portion of public transit budgets are for driver salaries, and what are the barriers to replacing drivers with artificial intelligence? Who wants to tackle that one? And you've got a microphone in front of you.
Yeah, I do. So PSTA has about 600 employees. About 500 of those are engaged in the operation. There's about 400 of those that are operators. So the other 100 are folks in maintenance and other operations management. So a very large portion of our budget, and I was, the look on my face was like, just look at the budget yesterday. And I didn't stare down that particular item. But also with that, you know, it's not just their salaries, it's all the fringe benefits. A good portion of our budget is focused on operators. We also work in a union environment. And so bringing on new technologies, we have to be aware of where we are at the same time that we're aware of where we're going. So we wouldn't turn around and immediately convert an entire fleet, but we would bring on new technologies in concert with our discussions with the union. There is a potential cost savings of changing technologies. There's also hidden costs that we don't always think about. So one of the discussions that we're having right now in bringing on electric vehicles is that as we go to an all-electric fleet, if that's what the board decides to do, we would not be training mechanics anymore, we would be training electricians. And so we have to look at our workforce and how it changes with the technology. So we may not completely remove those particular people from our budget, we may change their functions.
Do you want to take a crack at that, Alicia?
A few things. It's funny, we just passed our budget on Monday, so got the numbers. Our operating budget's about 70 million a year. Our numbers are about the same. We have to add, we have streetcar too, so we have a whole team that, we operate the TECO streetcar. It's similar. I mean, we have a union environment also, so it's not like we could just say, hey, we're switching over to AV, and then you're still gonna have to have somebody based upon Florida law being on there. But, a lot of our budget is tied into people. I mean, it's the salaries, it's the fringe benefits and everything, and I think any organization would say that, but our people is what make us great too. So yes, we're talking about AV, I think everybody is, we're rolling that out. But we're making sure that the union is part of this. At the beginning of our communication with us, maybe we didn't do as good of a job. It adds concerns, but we believe they're on board.
And I think we have some of the same discussions in the trucking industry. So it's any of these sort of mobility services are going to be affected by these technology changes.
Absolutely.
Back to the Skytrain product for Mr. Nocera. What is the load capacity in pounds of your LEV craft?
For the four-person vehicle, it's 1,200 pounds, and it's half that for the two-person vehicle.
Okay. That was fairly quick and easy. We'll try to get one or two more in here. Let's see, if a system is to be profitable, would you support a private enterprise solution to finance it?
Absolutely.
Kind of hard to argue with that one,
Next question, please.
Other than traditional system solutions, more roads, buses, tolls, light rail, etc., what new technology is available now? Gondolas. Not a new technology, though.
But not a new technology. Fair.
What are the emerging technologies that you see being most able to be rapidly deployed in, say, the next 6 months to a year to 2 years? Any thoughts on that?
Shannon? I think we've seen some of them today. I think that we are focused on testing those right now. At PSTA, we're looking very closely at what HART is doing on their autonomous vehicle pilot on Marion Street, but also looking at how we can change the environments that those vehicles are operating in. So we're doing some research on the evolution of the autonomous vehicle or the driverless vehicle in a mixed traffic situation and what that might look like. And what we're getting back from manufacturers like Easy Mile is it's about 1.5 years to 2 years away, and so our plan is to be ready to do a pilot in a non-exclusive guideway environment in about that time.
I think one of the things that's important, and I feel very strongly about this, like in Medellin, Colombia right now, they're also deploying escalators as a form of public transit because, of course, they have a lot of hills and all that. I think sometimes we get really fixated on this idea of the newest, the fastest, the best, and we forget that there's the invention half, which is coming up with something new. And then there's the innovation half of the equation, which is looking at what solutions are already out there and figuring out a better way to use them. And I think that, and again, forget about the gondolas, but let's look at things like escalators. How are these things being used? You know, there's a lot of opportunities out there that I think we sometimes get blinded by the newest, flashiest thing, rather than sort of going back a few years and seeing what worked in the past.
And back to Cassandra and I think Lucian as well. Talk a little bit about the Uber Transit on Demand, partnerships and users of the app and One Bus Away and things like that. What are your users of the service saying? What are the pros and cons of the subsidized app program?
I'm gonna have to pass this to my lifeline,
Yeah.
Shannon. on that.
Okay.
He's not going.
So as far as our Uber services or, you know, partnerships with transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, is that we don't ever do a partnership like that in isolation. We have a certain amount of our population that is uncomfortable with using that particular technology, whether they don't have the user side of the technology, they may not have a smartphone, or they're just not used to using it. And so we do have in all of our programs several different ways that people can access them. We could, you know, working in a public environment, you have to be equitable and you have to be accessible. And so we do have Uber and Lyft. We also have United Taxi, and we have two wheelchair transportation service providers that are also participating. And so that becomes very important to making sure that that people have access. As far as what people are saying is, the people who are using it absolutely love it because it's given them the kind of freedom that they haven't had before. Especially with our programs, which this is my favorite one, is the TD Late Shift program, because it is completely complementary to our system because it's operating from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And so people who wouldn't have been able to get a job because they couldn't get to the job are now being able to go to work every single night. And that is probably the biggest success for us and our programs to date, is that we're not just doing things differently, we are getting people jobs differently.
Yes, I wanted to express how the community has received very well the complementary services of shared services, ride share, as well as public transportation. For example, we have a taxi voucher program at heart where our paratransit services are just overloaded. And with the limited resources that we have, we're able to use the taxi voucher program to extend our resources and actually continue to serve the public, because as a public transportation agency, that's our main goal, is to serve the public. So if we make partnerships with ride shared services and the taxi systems, then that's a better way that we can obtain that in a more efficient manner. So it's working out really good, especially from the technology standpoint. With One Bus Away, the upcoming integration with bike share, we're looking to also add the streetcar system if the ferry system comes back. Being able to have all these multi-modal options there in one spot really makes the community easier, the patrons easier to access this information. So it really joins together. It's not just us. We link and coordinate with the Bull Runner, with their shared bike services. So when you pull it all together, it just gives us options, because sometimes one mode of transportation may not complete all of our options. You may want to go to dinner with a ride share, well, you may want to go to work with mass transit. So you might want to take your bike. If it starts raining, put your bike on the bus. And so it all works together. So it's really creating a network system with all these different services.
Okay, we're about at the end of our time. Before I ask you all to thank our panel members, I'd like to single out Sarah Caper of our staff. She is amazing. She did a great job. Each of our speakers coordinated through Sarah. She coordinated with Ruth Eckert and really put things together. So thank you Hillary as well. And let's give a round of applause to our panel members. I know I didn't get to everybody's question. What we're going to do is go through the questions. We'll work with our panel members. We'll try to get responses to each one of these, put them up on our website along with the presentations that each gave. We will have a conversation with our board following this forum and start looking at how we can begin moving the ball forward with some of these initiatives and seeing where we go next in terms of the public sector role in facilitating development of some better transit solutions for all of our communities. So thank you all, appreciate your time. Thank you all for being here, really appreciate your thoughtful attention to this effort.